The scent of lemon and rosemary still hung in the air, a ghost of the dinner she'd planned. Her hand rested on the swell of her belly, a silent promise to the life within. She was humming a half-forgotten lullaby when the world tilted, the soft rug rising up to meet her in a dizzying, violent rush. Darkness swallowed the edges of her vision. Her last conscious thought wasn't of pain or fear for herself, but a desperate, silent scream for the man who promised to protect them both. He was on his way. He would save them. But when the hospital doors finally hissed open, he wasn't alone. And the hand he was holding wasn't hers. The afternoon sun, warm and golden, streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, painting stripes of light across the plush cream carpet. It was a perfect day, the kind of day that felt like a promise. Isabella moved through the spacious apartment with the slow, deliberate grace of late pregnancy, a contented smile playing on her lips. At 7.5 months, her world had shrunk to the beautiful, burgeoning sphere of her baby bump, a constant, tangible reminder of the love that had created it. She trailed a hand over the cool marble of the kitchen island, her fingers tracing the faint gray veins that ran through the stone like delicate lifelines. Everything in this home, this life, felt solid, permanent. She had spent the morning preparing for Mark's return. He was closing a multi-million-dollar merger today, the culmination of months of sleepless nights and relentless work. He'd called her that morning, his voice a low, tired rumble she adored. "Just a few more hours, my love. Then it's just you and me." "And little Bean," he'd murmured, and she could picture his tired eyes crinkling in a smile. She'd promised him his favorite meal, roasted chicken with lemon and rosemary, the apartment already fragrant with the aroma of their shared history. It was the first meal she had ever cooked for him, back in her tiny fourth-floor walk-up, a lifetime away from this glass tower in the sky. A gentle flutter from within her womb brought her back to the present. She laughed softly, a hand instinctively cradling the precious weight. "Impatient, are we?" she whispered to the bump. "Daddy will be home soon." She felt a profound sense of peace, a deep, resonant hum of happiness that seemed to vibrate in tune with the city humming far below. Their life was a masterpiece they had painted together. Mark, with his fierce ambition and unwavering drive, had built an empire from nothing. He was the architect of their success, a man who could command boardrooms and bend markets to his will. But she was the curator of their joy, the keeper of their home, the soft place for him to land. She had smoothed his rough edges, tempered his anxieties, and loved him with a quiet ferocity that he said was his anchor in a turbulent world. She walked into the nursery, a room painted in the softest shades of dove gray and buttery yellow. A whimsical mural of hot air balloons drifted across one wall, each basket carrying a different woodland creature. She had painted it herself, spending weeks perched on a ladder, her body changing day by day, pouring all her love and dreams for this child into every brushstroke. She ran her hand over the smooth, cool wood of the crib, a gift from Mark's parents, and adjusted the tiny hand-knitted blanket draped over the side. Everything was ready. All that was missing was their baby and Mark. The first sign that something was wrong was a dull ache in her lower back, a persistent throb that she initially dismissed as a normal pregnancy complaint. She'd had them before. She drank a glass of water and sat on the edge of the large, comfortable armchair in the living room, propping her feet up on an ottoman. She picked up the book lying on the side table, a collection of fairy tales she'd been meaning to read to the baby. But the words swam before her eyes. The ache intensified, wrapping around her abdomen in a tight, constricting band. A wave of dizziness washed over her, sudden and disorienting. The room seemed to blur at the edges, the golden afternoon light turning sharp and hostile. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the haze of pain. This wasn't normal. This wasn't like the other aches. She reached for her phone on the table beside her, her fingers fumbling, suddenly clumsy and uncooperative. She needed to call Mark. He would know what to do. He always knew what to do. Her thumb swiped clumsily across the screen, the contact list a meaningless jumble of letters. The pain crested, a brutal, searing wave that stole her breath and made her gasp. Her vision narrowed to a tunnel. The phone slipped from her grasp, clattering onto the thick rug with a muffled thud. Another wave of pain hit, stronger this time, a vicious clawing from within. She cried out, a sound swallowed by the opulent silence of the penthouse. She tried to push herself up, to crawl to the phone, to do something, but her limbs felt heavy, disconnected from her will. A strange metallic taste filled her mouth. The light from the window seemed impossibly bright, a glaring spotlight on her terror. She could feel a dampness spreading through her dress, and a new, more terrifying fear gripped her. The baby, her baby. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, she managed to pull herself onto her hands and knees. The city, usually a comforting presence, now seemed distant and indifferent through the vast windows. She was alone, trapped in her perfect, gilded cage. "Mark," she whispered, the name a ragged prayer on her lips. "Please, hurry." The floor felt cold against her cheek as she slumped forward. The rhythmic kicking in her womb, which had been a source of such joy just moments before, now felt frantic, a desperate Morse code she couldn't decipher. The lullaby she had been humming earlier echoed in her mind, a sweet, heartbreaking melody of a life that was suddenly, terrifyingly hanging by a thread. The world wasn't just tilting anymore. It was splintering, the light fading to black as the darkness rushed in to claim her. Her last coherent thought was an image of his face, smiling, promising her forever. Then there was only silence. The first thing Isabella was aware of was the beeping, a steady, monotonous rhythm that drilled into her consciousness, pulling her up from a thick, murky depth. Then came the smell, antiseptic, sterile, a clean, chemical scent that was the polar opposite of the rosemary and lemon that had filled her home. Her eyelids fluttered open, heavy as lead shutters. The light was harsh, fluorescent, a world away from the golden afternoon sun she remembered. She was in a hospital. The realization dawned slowly, bringing with it a tidal wave of panic. "My baby," she breathed, the words scraping her raw throat. Her hand flew to her abdomen, her fingers searching for the familiar, firm swell. It was still there, a hard, tense mound under the thin hospital blanket. A wave of relief, so potent it left her dizzy, washed over her. But the fear returned just as quickly, cold and sharp. Was the baby okay? What had happened? The memory of the collapse was a fractured nightmare. Pain, darkness, and a terrifying sense of helplessness. A nurse with kind, tired eyes appeared at her bedside. "Easy now, Mrs. Davison. You're safe. You gave us quite a scare." Is my baby all right?" Isabella's voice trembled. "Your baby is a fighter," the nurse said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "We're monitoring you both very closely. The doctor will be in to speak with you and your husband soon." Her husband, Mark. The relief came again, a second, weaker wave. Mark was here. He would make sense of this chaos. He would hold her hand and tell her everything was going to be fine, in that deep, confident voice that always made her believe it. "My husband, he's here. He arrived a little while ago. He's just down the hall speaking with the doctor," the nurse explained, fluffing her pillow with practiced efficiency. He was very worried. The words were meant to be a comfort, and they were. Of course he was worried. He loved her. He loved their baby. She closed her eyes, picturing him pacing the hallway, his handsome face etched with concern, running a hand through his dark hair. The image was so clear, so reassuring, it almost eclipsed the persistent, rhythmic beeping of the machine she was tethered to. She just needed to see him. Once she saw him, the fear that coiled in her gut would finally recede. After what felt like an eternity, the door to her room swished open. Isabella's heart leaped, a painful, hopeful thud against her ribs. "Mark!" she called out, pushing herself up on her elbows. It was him. His tall, broad-shouldered frame filled the doorway. He was still in the bespoke suit he'd worn for his meeting, though the tie was loosened and his hair was slightly disheveled. But he wasn't looking at her. His gaze was directed over his shoulder, back into the hallway, and his expression wasn't one of pure, unadulterated worry. It was complicated, guarded, and he wasn't alone. A woman stood slightly behind him, half hidden by his frame. She was younger, with sleek, raven black hair cut in a sharp, modern bob that contrasted with Isabella's own soft, honey blonde waves. She wore a stylish, form-fitting dress, her makeup immaculate. Even from across the room, Isabella could see the gloss on her lips and the sharp, perfect wing of her eyeliner. She looked entirely out of place in the sterile, unforgiving light of the hospital room, like a glossy magazine page ripped out and carelessly dropped into a medical textbook. For a moment, Isabella's mind refused to process the scene. A colleague. Yes, that must be it. A junior associate from the firm, perhaps? Someone who had been with him when he got the call, who had given him a ride to the hospital. It was the only explanation that made sense. Then the woman stepped forward, moving from behind Mark's shadow into the full light. And as she did, Mark reached back, his hand finding hers, their fingers lacing together in a gesture of casual, unconscious intimacy that struck Isabella with the force of a physical blow. It was the way he held her hand, the familiar possessive clasp of his fingers, the way his thumb would stroke the back of her hand. Seeing it bestowed upon another was like watching a stranger wear her wedding ring. The world seemed to slow down, the beeping of the heart monitor suddenly loud, frantic, echoing the frantic drumming in her ears. Who was this woman? Why was her husband holding her hand while his pregnant wife lay in a hospital bed after collapsing? The questions swirled in her mind, a vortex of confusion and a dark, creeping dread. Mark finally looked at her, his blue eyes clouded with an emotion she couldn't name. It wasn't relief. It wasn't just worry. It was guilt. A deep, profound guilt that he wore like a shroud. "Bella," he began, his voice strained. He took a step into the room, still holding the other woman's hand. He didn't seem to know what to do with it, as if he'd forgotten it was there, attached to another person. The woman's eyes, cool, gray, and appraising, flickered over Isabella, taking in the hospital gown, the IV drip, the mess of her unbrushed hair against the pillow. There was no pity in her gaze, only a calm, unnerving assessment. "Mark, who is this?" Isabella's voice was barely a whisper. The air in the room had become thick, heavy, pressing down on her chest. Mark's jaw tightened. He dropped the woman's hand as if it had suddenly become red hot. But the damage was done. The image was seared into Isabella's mind. "Bella, this is Chloe. She works with me." He gestured vaguely between them. She brought me here." The lie was so clumsy, so transparent, it was almost insulting. Chloe didn't look like an assistant who had simply given her boss a ride. She looked like a woman who belonged at his side. There was a possessiveness in her stance, a subtle confidence in the way she stood near him, that screamed of a familiarity that went far beyond the boardroom. Isabella stared at her husband, the man she had loved since she was 22, the man who had vowed to cherish and protect her, the father of her unborn child. And in that moment, she saw him not as her husband, but as a stranger. The pieces of the puzzle began to click into place with horrifying speed. The late nights he'd attributed to work, the sudden, unexplained business trips, the slight, almost imperceptible distance that had grown between them in recent months, a distance she had convinced herself was just the stress of the merger. "Get her out," Isabella said, her voice shaking but laced with a sudden cold fury. Mark flinched. "Bella, please, just listen. I said get her out." Her voice rose, raw and ragged. The beeping of the heart monitor sped up, a frantic, high-pitched alarm. "Now!" The carefully constructed world of their penthouse, the scent of rosemary, the promise of a shared future, it all shattered. In its place was the harsh, fluorescent reality of this hospital room, the sterile smell of betrayal, and the devastating presence of the woman who was holding her husband's hand. The lullaby was over. The silence that followed was deafening. The silence in the hospital room after Chloe's hasty retreat was a living entity. It pulsed with unspoken accusations and the wreckage of a decade-long love story. Mark stood awkwardly by the door, his expensive suit looking rumpled and absurd in the sterile environment. He looked like a man caught between two worlds, belonging to neither. For Isabella, the world had been reduced to the stark white of the sheets and the terrifyingly erratic rhythm of the heart monitor, a soundtrack to her personal apocalypse. Her fury had subsided, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache that was far worse than the physical pain. Her mind, seeking refuge from the unbearable present, drifted back. It was a defense mechanism, a way to find the loose thread, the single stitch that, when pulled, would unravel this entire nightmare and reveal it as a terrible mistake. She saw their wedding day, Mark's eyes shining with such adoration she'd felt like the only woman in the world. He'd whispered in her ear during their first dance, his breath warm against her skin. "You are my true north, Bella. Always." Had that been a lie? She remembered the night they decided to start a family. They were in Paris, a ridiculously cliché but perfect trip to celebrate their 5th anniversary. They'd stood on the balcony of their hotel room, the Eiffel Tower glittering in the distance. Mark had wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder, one hand protectively covering hers on the swell of her still flat stomach. "I'm ready," he'd said, his voice thick with emotion. "I want to see your eyes looking back at me from our son's face. I want to hear our daughter laugh." The sincerity of that moment had been absolute. She'd felt it in the core of her being. How could a man capable of such profound tenderness also be capable of this casual, soul-crushing deceit? The signs, she realized now, had been there, like faint cracks in a beautiful vase, invisible until the moment it shatters. The late nights had started about 6 months ago. The merger, he'd called it, his magnum opus. He'd come home smelling of a perfume that wasn't hers, a sharp floral scent she'd once wrinkled her nose at. "It's Sarah from accounting," he'd explained with a dismissive wave of his hand. "She practically bathes in it." Isabella had believed him. Why wouldn't she? Trust was the bedrock of their marriage. Then there was the phone. His constant companion, always angled away from her, a muted buzz on the nightstand that would often draw him out of the room. "Work," he'd say, closing the bedroom door gently behind him. She'd felt a prickle of annoyance, a flicker of suspicion, but had quickly extinguished it. She wouldn't be that wife, the suspicious, nagging woman she'd always pitied. Mark was under immense pressure. It was her job to be his sanctuary, not another source of stress. She had chosen to be understanding, but now she saw that her understanding had simply been permission. Her trust had been a blindfold. The most painful memory was from just 3 weeks ago. It was her baby shower. The penthouse was filled with flowers, laughter, and the happy chatter of her friends and family. Mark had been the perfect host, charming and attentive, but she'd caught a moment. He was standing by the window on the phone, his back to the room. She'd seen his reflection in the glass. He wasn't talking business. He was smiling, a private, intimate smile she hadn't seen directed at her in months. He'd laughed softly, a low, secret sound. When he turned and saw her watching, the smile vanished, replaced by a bland, neutral mask. "Just confirming a dinner reservation for next week," he'd said smoothly. "For us." The dinner, of course, had been canceled at the last minute, an unavoidable client emergency. From Mark's perspective, the descent had been gradual, a series of small compromises that had led to an avalanche. Chloe had joined the firm a year ago. She was brilliant, ambitious, and sharp in a way that had initially intimidated, then intrigued him. She saw the world as he did, a series of challenges to be conquered. Their work on the merger had thrown them together for hours on end, fueled by caffeine and takeout. In the crucible of late-night strategy sessions and high-stakes negotiations, a different kind of intimacy had been forged. Chloe didn't need him to be her anchor. She was her own. She didn't ask him about his feelings. She challenged his ideas. She didn't want a sanctuary. She thrived in the storm right alongside him. One night after they'd landed a pivotal part of the deal, the adrenaline had been electric. They'd shared a bottle of scotch in his office. The city lights spread out below them like a carpet of diamonds. She had looked at him, her gray eyes cutting through his exhaustion, and said, "You're a titan, Mark, but even titans get lonely at the top." And she had leaned in and kissed him. He hadn't pushed her away. In that moment, he felt seen in a way he hadn't in years. He loved Isabella. He truly did. He loved her softness, her goodness, the peaceful world she created for him. But it was a world he felt he had to protect, a world he couldn't bring his full, predatory corporate self into. With Chloe, he didn't have to compartmentalize. The affair had been a relief, a separate, sealed-off part of his life where he could be the man he was at work all the time. He had told himself it wasn't about love. It was a pressure valve. He told himself it didn't diminish what he had with Isabella. He could have both. He was Mark Davison. He was a master at managing complex systems. He thought he could manage this. Today, when he'd gotten the call from the paramedics, his two worlds had collided with the force of a nuclear explosion. His first instinct had been raw terror for Isabella and the baby. He'd been about to leave a celebratory lunch with Chloe. She had seen the panic on his face, grabbed his keys, and driven him, her calmness a stark contrast to his frantic state. In the car, he had broken down, the fear and guilt a toxic cocktail in his gut, and she had taken his hand. It had been a simple gesture of support, but in that moment of crisis, he had clung to it like a drowning man. Walking into that hospital room with her had been a catastrophic miscalculation. The act of a man so used to having everything under his control that he'd lost his moral compass entirely. Back in the room, Isabella looked at the stranger wearing her husband's face. "How long?" she asked, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. Mark finally moved, walking slowly to the foot of her bed. He looked utterly defeated. "Bella, it's not what you think." A dry, humorless laugh escaped her lips. "Isn't it? Then what is it, Mark? What exactly am I supposed to think when my husband shows up with another woman while I'm in the hospital, possibly losing our child?" "It started 6 months ago," he finally admitted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "It was a mistake, a stupid, meaningless mistake." "Meaningless," she repeated, the word a dagger. "The last 6 months of my life, of our lives, have been a lie. I've been sitting at home, painting a nursery, waiting for you, while you were with her. Does that feel meaningless to you?" He had no answer. The tapestry of their life, once so rich and vibrant, was now revealed to be a threadbare cloth, woven with deception. And as Isabella lay there, tethered to machines, with the life of her child hanging in the balance, she knew that some things, once torn, could never be woven back together again. The hours that followed were a blur of medical jargon and hushed, serious conversations. Dr. Evans, a calm, gray-haired woman with compassionate eyes, became the arbiter of their fate. She explained the situation in measured tones that did little to soften the blow. Isabella had suffered a severe placental abruption. The collapse hadn't just been a dizzy spell. It was her body's emergency signal that the lifeline to her baby was detaching. They were both in critical condition. Isabella had lost a significant amount of blood, and the baby was in distress, deprived of oxygen and nutrients. "We're doing everything we can to stabilize you both," Dr. Evans said, her gaze shifting between Isabella's pale face and Mark's haunted one. "But I need to be frank. The next 24 hours are crucial. We need to keep the baby in utero for as long as possible to give the lungs more time to develop. But if the baby's heart rate drops again, or if your bleeding worsens, we'll have to perform an emergency C-section. It's a significant risk for both of you at this stage." Every word was a hammer blow, a choice between two impossibilities, a risk to her, a risk to the baby. The child she had nurtured for almost 8 months, the tiny being whose every kick and flutter she had cherished, was now in a desperate fight for life. The weight of it was crushing, a physical pressure on her chest that made it hard to breathe. Mark stood by the window, his back to the room, staring out at the sprawling city below. The titan of industry, the man who could move markets with a single phone call, was utterly powerless. The guilt was radiating from him in waves, a toxic energy that filled the small room. He had been so consumed with conquering his world that he had failed to protect his own. The irony was devastating. He had sought a thrill, a release from pressure, with Chloe, and in doing so, had created a pressure cooker of a crisis so immense it threatened to incinerate everything he held dear. He kept replaying the last few months in his head, the moments he had chosen a late night with Chloe over a quiet evening with Isabella. The times he had silenced his phone, ignoring a call from his pregnant wife because he was tangled in the sheets of a hotel bed across town. Each memory was a fresh torment. He remembered Isabella showing him a tiny pair of booties she had knitted, her face glowing with pride. He had been distracted, answering a work email on his phone, and had given her a cursory, "That's nice, honey." The memory now made him physically ill. He had been present in body, but his soul had been elsewhere. And now he would give anything, his entire fortune, his company, his life to go back and simply be present. For Isabella, the betrayal and the medical crisis merged into a single, overwhelming wave of trauma. As nurses came and went, checking her vitals, adjusting her IV, speaking in low, professional tones, she felt a profound sense of detachment, as if she were watching a movie about someone else's life. But inside, a quiet seismic shift was occurring. The initial shock was beginning to crystallize into a cold, hard resolve. The woman who had blindly trusted, who had made her husband the center of her universe, was fading. In her place, a mother was being forged in the fires of fear and betrayal. Her focus narrowed to one thing: the tiny, fragile life inside her. This child, who had done nothing to deserve this, was now paying the price for its father's sins. A fierce, primal protectiveness rose up in her, eclipsing her own pain, her own heartbreak. She no longer had the luxury of being a scorned wife. She had to be a warrior. Late that night, as an exhausted Mark finally slumped into the uncomfortable visitor's chair by her bed, she spoke, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through the sterile hum of the machines. "I don't want you to touch me," she said, not looking at him. Her eyes were fixed on the ceiling, as if she could see through it to the stars beyond. He flinched as if struck. He had reached out a hand, wanting to offer some small comfort, to bridge the cavernous gap that had opened between them. He let his hand fall to his side. "Bella, I am so sorry." "Sorry isn't a strong enough word, Mark," she replied, her voice still unnervingly calm. "Sorry is for when you spill coffee on someone. It's not for this." She finally turned her head, her gaze meeting his. The warm, loving light he was used to seeing in her eyes was gone, replaced by something hard and unyielding, like polished stone. "You didn't just break my heart. You put our child's life in danger. Your distraction, your lies, they have consequences. This is the consequence." He opened his mouth to defend himself, to explain, to make her understand the pressures he was under, but he stopped. He could see the futility of it. His reasons, which had seemed so compelling in the secret world he'd built with Chloe, were nothing but pathetic excuses in the harsh light of this reality. "The doctor said I need to avoid stress," Isabella continued, her voice gaining strength. "And looking at you, knowing what you did, where you were while I was lying on the floor, that is the greatest stress I can imagine. So I'm going to focus on our baby. I'm going to lie here, and I'm going to breathe, and I'm going to fight for our child, and you are going to sit there, and you are going to be silent. You are not the person I can lean on right now. You are the storm I have to survive." The verdict had been delivered. It wasn't from Dr. Evans, but from his wife. He was guilty. His sentence was to bear witness to the potential destruction he had caused, stripped of the right to offer comfort, his love now a source of pain rather than solace. As the long night stretched on, and the beep of the fetal monitor became the only sound that mattered, Mark began to understand the true cost of his betrayal. It wasn't just the loss of his wife's trust. It was the loss of his own soul. He had traded gold for dust, and the weight of his foolishness was heavier than any empire. The shift was palpable. Isabella was no longer just fighting for her baby. She was fighting for herself, drawing a line in the sand. On one side was the future of her child. On the other was the man who had almost cost them everything. The following days were a delicate, terrifying tightrope walk. Isabella remained on strict bed rest, a prisoner of the sterile room and the constant, vigilant beeping of the monitors. The immediate crisis had passed, but they were not out of the woods. Every day the baby stayed safely inside her was a victory, a small miracle celebrated with the quiet nods of nurses and the cautiously optimistic reports from Dr. Evans. Time, once an abstract concept, was now measured in heartbeats, her own and the precious, fragile rhythm of her child's. Mark was a ghost haunting the edges of her reality. He was always there, a somber presence in the visitor's chair, his phone silenced, his empire building on hold. He looked diminished, his expensive suits replaced by nondescript sweaters, dark circles under his eyes telling a story of sleepless, guilt-ridden nights spent on the lumpy vinyl couch in the family waiting room. He spoke only when spoken to, fetching her water, adjusting her pillows, performing small, penitent acts of service that she accepted with a cool, detached politeness. The silence between them was a chasm, filled with the wreckage of their shared past and the uncertainty of their future. During those long, quiet hours, suspended between fear and hope, Isabella found a clarity she had never known. The betrayal had acted like a brutal, clarifying solvent, stripping away the non-essential, leaving only the core of what truly mattered. Her identity had been so entwined with Mark's. She had been Isabella, Mark's wife, for so long that she had forgotten who Isabella was on her own. She had built her life around his, her happiness contingent on his. Lying in that bed, fighting for her child's life, she realized the profound danger of such a dependency. Her love for Mark had not vanished overnight. It was a deep foundational part of her, and its fracturing was an agony. She would look at him when he thought she was sleeping, and a wave of grief for the man she thought she had married would wash over her. But the grief was now mingled with a new, steely resolve. She could love the memory of that man, but she could not trust the man sitting in the chair before her. Trust, once shattered, did not magically reappear. And without it, love was just a ghost. The turning point came a week after her collapse. Dr. Evans came in, her face brighter than Isabella had seen it yet. "Good news," she announced. "You're both responding remarkably well. We've managed to stave off premature labor for now. Every day is a gift, and you've given your baby a precious one." The relief was so immense, Isabella felt tears spring to her eyes. For the first time in a week, she allowed a flicker of genuine hope to warm the cold fear in her chest. The baby was going to be okay. They were going to make it. Later that afternoon, after the doctor had left, she turned to Mark. It was the first time she had initiated a real conversation since her ultimatum. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady. He looked up, startled, a desperate hope flickering in his tired eyes. "Bella, anything." "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she began, her hands resting protectively on her belly. "About us. About this baby." She took a deep breath, marshaling her strength. "When I get out of this hospital, I am not coming back to the penthouse." The hope in his eyes died, replaced by a raw, naked panic. "What?" "Bella, no. That's our home. We can work through this. I'll do anything. I'll go to therapy. I'll quit my job. I'll sell the company. Whatever it takes." She shook her head, a slow, sad gesture. "This isn't something you can fix with a grand gesture, Mark. This isn't a business deal you can renegotiate. You broke the foundation. The penthouse, it's not a home anymore. It's a crime scene. Every room is tainted with your lies. Please," he begged, his voice cracking. He moved to kneel by her bedside, but she held up a hand, stopping him. The gesture was small, but it was a wall. "This is not about punishing you," she said, and she realized with a startling clarity that it was true. This wasn't about revenge. It was about survival. "This is about me. This is about what I need to feel safe. It's about what this child needs. A baby doesn't need a penthouse and a millionaire father. A baby needs peace. It needs a mother who isn't constantly looking over her shoulder, waiting for the other shoe to drop." She continued, the words she had been rehearsing in the silence of the long nights pouring out of her. "I will never keep our child from you. You are the father, and you will have a place in their life. But us, Mark and Isabella, that is over. I need to find a new place to live, a place that feels like mine. I need to build a new life, for me and for this baby, a life built on truth." The finality in her voice was absolute. This was not a negotiation. It was a declaration of independence. Mark stared at her, his face ashen. He was finally seeing the true consequence of his actions. It wasn't a temporary separation or an angry outburst. It was the complete and total dismantling of the life he had taken for granted. He saw the strength in her, a quiet, unshakable force he had never recognized because he had been too busy looking for his own reflection in her eyes. He had wanted her to be his sanctuary, but he had failed to realize that sanctuaries need to be protected, not desecrated. "I love you," he whispered, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "I know," she said, and for the first time a tear traced a path down her cheek. "That's the tragedy of it, isn't it? I love you too, but love, I'm learning, is not enough." The weight of her choice settled in the room. It was a heavy, terrifying thing to consciously choose to walk away from a life of comfort and security, to choose the uncertainty of single motherhood over the familiarity of a broken marriage. But as she made the choice, as she spoke her truth, Isabella felt not fear, but a profound sense of empowerment. She was no longer a victim of her husband's betrayal. She was the architect of her own future. She was choosing peace over passion, truth over comfort, and above all, she was choosing her child. It was the hardest decision of her life, and the first one that felt entirely her own. 2 days after Isabella's declaration, as the fragile truce of their new reality settled over the hospital room, an unexpected visitor appeared. It wasn't Chloe, as Mark had half feared, but an older woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and a tailored suit that spoke of money and power. She introduced herself as Eleanor Vance, and her name sent a jolt through Mark. Eleanor Vance was not just any lawyer. She was Chloe's mentor, a legendary figure in corporate law and a senior partner at a rival firm. "Mr. Davison," she began, her voice crisp and devoid of warmth, completely ignoring Isabella. "I believe you know my associate, Chloe Pierce. I'm here on her behalf." Mark's blood ran cold. He stood up, instinctively placing himself between the woman and Isabella's bed. "This is neither the time nor the place." Eleanor Vance raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "On the contrary, I think it's the perfect place. A place of consequences." She finally deigned to look at Isabella, her expression a mixture of pity and disdain. "My client has been made out to be a villain in this sordid little drama, and I'm here to provide some much-needed context." "I think you should leave," Isabella said, her voice quiet but firm, her hand resting on her belly. "I'm sure you do," Eleanor retorted, "but Chloe has a right to not have her career and reputation destroyed by your husband's recklessness. And you, my dear, have a right to know who you're really married to." She placed a thin manila file on the small table by the window. "Mark didn't just have an affair. He used Chloe. He leveraged her ambition and her access to my firm's resources to gain an unfair advantage in his merger. He didn't just cheat on his wife. He engaged in corporate espionage with my protégé as his unwilling, and later, very willing, accomplice." The air was sucked out of the room. Isabella stared at Mark, whose face had gone deathly pale. This was a new, unimagined layer of deceit. His betrayal wasn't just personal, it was professional. It wasn't just a sin of passion, it was a calculated, strategic crime. Eleanor continued, her words precise and cutting. "Chloe is many things. Ambitious, certainly. Naive, perhaps. But she is not a homewrecker by trade. She fell for a man who mirrored her own drive. A man who promised her a partnership not just in bed, but in business. He told her his marriage was a hollow shell, a business arrangement. He told her you both lived separate lives and that a divorce was imminent once the baby was born." Each lie was a fresh stab wound to Isabella's heart. He had not only cheated on her, he had erased her. He had painted their love, their home, their shared life as a hollow facade to seduce another woman. "She gave him everything," Eleanor said, her voice softening with a flicker of genuine anger. "Confidential information, strategic insights. She risked her entire future for him. And when this unfortunate incident occurred and he realized his carefully compartmentalized life was about to implode, he was ready to cut her loose, to paint her as a hysterical mistress and himself as the penitent husband, rushing back to his sainted, pregnant wife's side. Chloe is not the only victim here, Mrs. Davison, but she is the one who stands to lose everything, while your husband will likely weather this storm with his fortune intact." Eleanor Vance had not come to threaten or blackmail. She had come to plant a seed of doubt, to recalibrate the narrative. She was protecting her asset, her protégé, by exposing the full scope of Mark's duplicity. With a final sharp look at Mark, she turned and left, the file sitting on the table like a ticking bomb. For a long time, there was only the sound of the monitors. Then Isabella spoke, her voice a dead whisper. "Is it true?" Mark couldn't look at her. He sank into the chair, his head in his hands. "It's complicated. Complicated is the word men like you use when you don't want to say yes," Isabella shot back, her voice trembling with a fresh wave of fury. This was so much worse. The affair she could almost understand on some primal, painful level. But this was a character indictment. The man she married wasn't just unfaithful. He was ruthless, manipulative, and corrupt. He hadn't just broken her heart. He had used another woman, risked her career, and built the latest chapter of his success on a foundation of lies and theft. The new information changed everything. Her decision to leave him was no longer just about her own emotional well-being. It was about moral integrity. How could she raise a child with a man whose entire value system was so fundamentally broken? What lessons would her son or daughter learn from a father who believed the ends always justified the means, no matter who got hurt? She thought of Chloe. Before, she had been a faceless villain, a Jezebel. Now she was a person, albeit one Isabella had no desire to ever meet. A woman who, like her, had been manipulated by Mark's ambition. They were not friends, not allies, but they were both victims of the same man's profound selfishness. It was a strange, unsettling, and deeply lonely realization. "Get out," Isabella said, the words falling like chips of ice into the silent room. "Bella, please," he whispered, looking up, his face a mask of desperation. "I mean it, Mark," she said, her voice rising with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "I want you to leave the hospital. Don't be here when I wake up. I need to think. I need to breathe air that you haven't poisoned with your lies." She pointed a shaking finger toward the door. "Go, and take your file with you." The echo of Eleanor Vance's revelations reverberated long after Mark had gone. It was an echo from his past, a past he had tried to keep hidden, a past that revealed the rot at the core of their beautiful life. Isabella was alone now, truly alone, not just with a broken heart, but with the terrifying knowledge that the man she had promised her life to was a complete and utter stranger, and she was about to bring their child into a world where its father's legacy was one of ruin. The weight of her choices suddenly felt heavier than ever before, but her resolve had never been stronger. She wasn't just leaving a cheating husband. She was escaping a moral vacuum. The stress of Eleanor's revelations took its toll. That evening, the alarms on Isabella's monitors, which had been blessedly silent for days, began to shriek with renewed urgency. The baby's heart rate was dropping precipitously. A swarm of nurses and doctors descended on the room, their faces grim, their movements efficient and swift. Dr. Evans's calm voice cut through the chaos. "That's it. We can't wait any longer. We're going to the OR. Now." Fear, stark and absolute, seized Isabella. It was too soon. Her baby wasn't ready. She wasn't ready. In that moment of pure terror, a primal, instinctual part of her cried out for Mark. Despite the lies, despite the betrayal, he was her partner, the other half of this creation. But he was gone. She had sent him away. She was alone. A nurse with warm hands took hers. "You're not alone," she said, her eyes meeting Isabella's. "We're all here with you. You can do this." As they rushed her down the hallway, the fluorescent lights overhead streaking into a blur, Isabella focused on that single thought. "I can do this." She was no longer Mark Davison's wife, a partner in a gilded life. She was Isabella, a woman, a mother, and her child needed her to be strong. She pushed aside the heartbreak and the anger, channeling every ounce of her remaining energy into a single, silent prayer for the life within her. The operating room was a cold, bright, alien world of gleaming steel and blue scrubs. The spinal block numbed her from the waist down, creating an even more profound sense of detachment. She was a passive participant in the most active, most important moment of her life. A blue curtain was erected at her chest, hiding the surgical proceedings, a flimsy barrier between her and her child's entry into the world. An anesthesiologist murmured comforting words by her ear, but she barely heard them. All she could focus on was the tugging and pressure, the strange, surreal sensations of the surgery. Where was Mark? Even as she focused on her own strength, the question echoed in the back of her mind. Had the hospital called him? Did he know? Did he care? Part of her, the wounded, scorned part, hoped he was miserable, racked with guilt. Another part, the part that still remembered the boy she'd fallen in love with, hoped he was on his way, that he would burst through the doors and be there for his child's birth. Mark, in fact, was in hell. After leaving the hospital, he had driven aimlessly for hours, Eleanor's words and Isabella's dismissal replaying in a torturous loop. He ended up at the skeletal frame of a new skyscraper his company was building, a monument to his ambition. Staring up at it, he felt nothing but disgust. He had sacrificed his integrity, his wife's heart, and his child's safety for What? Steel and glass? Another line on his resume? He finally got the call from the hospital while sitting in his car, overlooking the city. The nurse's voice was urgent. There was no time to think. He drove, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white, breaking every speed limit, his own heart a frantic, panicked drum against his ribs. He arrived breathless and wild-eyed to a deserted maternity ward waiting room. A nurse saw him and pointed him toward the surgical wing. "You're just in time," she said. He was scrubbed and gowned, a mask and cap hiding his identity, rendering him anonymous. He pushed through the OR doors just as Dr. Evans said, "Okay, here we go." He saw Isabella's face pale and strained above the blue curtain, her eyes closed. She hadn't seen him come in. He moved to her side, his heart aching. He reached out and took her hand. Her eyes snapped open, wide with shock. For a moment she stared at him, a storm of emotions passing through her gaze. Anger, relief, confusion. Her fingers tightened around his. She didn't pull away. In this moment of ultimate vulnerability, instinct trumped anger. They were in this together. Then a sound cut through the clinical beeping and hushed voices. A thin, wavering cry. It was the most fragile, most beautiful sound either of them had ever heard. "You have a son," Dr. Evans announced, her voice filled with warmth. Tears streamed down Isabella's face. Tears of relief, of joy, of pure, unadulterated love. Mark was openly sobbing behind his mask, his shoulders shaking. The nurse brought the baby over, a tiny, impossibly perfect creature wrapped in a white blanket. He was so small, his face red and scrunched, a tuft of dark hair clinging to his head. He was real, he was here, he was safe. Isabella reached out a trembling hand and touched her son's cheek. He instinctively turned toward her touch, his tiny mouth rooting. In that instant, the world fell away. There was no betrayal, no lies, no Chloe, no penthouse. There was only this new, fierce, all-consuming love. It was a love so powerful it rearranged the atoms in the room, the priorities of her universe. She looked at her son, then she looked at Mark. He was staring at the baby, his face a portrait of awe and utter devastation. He was seeing everything he had almost lost, everything he had so carelessly gambled away. He had made it for the first breath, but he was a stranger at the christening of his own son's life. "He's beautiful," Mark whispered, his voice thick with tears. "Yes, he is," Isabella replied, her voice soft but her eyes clear. The connection of holding his hand during the birth was a fleeting truce, an armistice in a time of crisis. But the war was not over. The arrival of their son wasn't a magic eraser. It was a catalyst. It was the reason the old life could never be rebuilt. This tiny, vulnerable person deserved more than a foundation of lies. He deserved a fortress of truth. The first breath their son took was an inhalation of new life. For Isabella, it was an exhalation of the past. For Mark, it was the suffocating realization of a future he may have already forfeited. The climax of the birth was not an ending, but a new and far more complicated beginning. The weeks that followed were a blur of recovery and discovery. Their son, whom Isabella named Leo, remained in the NICU, a tiny warrior in a plastic box, fighting to grow stronger. Isabella practically lived at the hospital, her world shrinking to the space between her recovery room and the neonatal unit. She spent her days holding Leo against her skin, a practice they called kangaroo care, whispering stories to him, humming the lullabies she thought she'd forgotten, and willing him to thrive with every fiber of her being. Mark was a peripheral figure in this new world. He was allowed to visit his son, to stand by the incubator and place a tentative hand through the porthole to touch Leo's tiny foot. Isabella watched him, her heart a tangle of conflicting emotions. She saw the raw, genuine love in his eyes as he looked at their son. But she also saw a broken man, grappling with the magnitude of his losses. He had arranged for a corporate jet to fly in the country's top neonatologist for a consultation. He had paid for a private room for Isabella and ensured she had everything she could possibly need. He was trying to fix things the only way he knew how, by throwing money at them. But he seemed to understand that the things he had truly broken were beyond financial repair. They spoke, but their conversations were stilted, logistical, revolving only around Leo. "The doctor said his oxygen levels were good today. I ordered dinner for you. It's on its way." The chasm between them remained. His presence was a constant, painful reminder of the betrayal. And yet, watching him with their son, she felt a flicker of something she could only describe as a profound, sorrowful pity. Chloe had disappeared. Mark later told her, in one of their brief, functional conversations, that he had come clean to his board of directors. He admitted to the corporate espionage, framing it as a personal failing and a catastrophic lapse in judgment. He preemptively resigned as CEO, selling a significant portion of his shares to ensure the company's stability. He had lost his empire, the thing he had built with such single-minded ferocity. Eleanor Vance and Chloe had, in exchange for his public self-immolation, agreed not to press charges. Chloe had taken a position at a firm in London, starting over. He had, in the end, lost both women, both lives he had tried so desperately to lead simultaneously. The day Leo was finally discharged was a day of quiet, monumental triumph. Isabella, with the help of her mother who had flown in, had found a small, charming, two-bedroom apartment in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood, a world away from the cold glass tower she had once called home. It was furnished with a mix of second-hand pieces and new simple items for the baby. It was small, but it was hers. It felt safe. Mark helped them move in, carrying boxes in a silence that was heavier than any furniture. When the last box was inside, he stood awkwardly in the center of the small living room, looking like a giant in a doll's house. Leo was asleep in his bassinet, his tiny chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. "Isabella," he began, his voice hoarse. "I know sorry is useless. I know I don't deserve it, but I want to ask for your forgiveness anyway. Not for me, but for him." He nodded toward the bassinet. "I don't want him to grow up in the shadow of my anger and your bitterness." Isabella looked at her sleeping son, then back at the man who was both a stranger and the most familiar person in the world to her. She had spent weeks wrestling with her anger, letting it burn through her, until all that was left was a sad gray ash. Holding Leo, feeling his unconditional, innocent love, had shown her the futility of holding on to hate. It was a poison, and she would not let it touch her son's world. "Forgiveness isn't a switch you can flip, Mark," she said softly. "It's a journey, and it's one I have to take for myself. I will never forget what you did, but for Leo's sake, I will not let it define our future. I will not raise our son in a house of anger." She took a deep breath. "I forgive the man I thought you were. I forgive the boy I fell in love with. The man you became. I don't know him well enough to forgive him yet, but I'm willing to try for Leo. It wasn't the absolution he craved, but it was more than he deserved. It was a sliver of grace, a crack of light in the darkness he had created." He nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "Thank you." Their new life took on a quiet rhythm. Mark was a consistent presence. He came over 3 times a week for dinner. He learned how to change diapers, how to soothe Leo's cries, how to give him a bath without getting soap in his eyes. He and Isabella were not partners, not lovers, but co-parents. They were 2 separate people, bound by their shared, infinite love for their child. They were building something new from the wreckage, not a marriage, but a family, redefined. One evening, as Mark was about to leave, he paused at the door. "You know," he said, looking around the small, cozy apartment, "I spent 10 years building a penthouse in the sky. It was big enough to get lost in, and I did." He looked at her, his eyes full of a painful, hard-won clarity. "You've built a real home here in 3 weeks." After he left, Isabella stood by the window, watching his car pull away. She felt a pang of sadness for what they had lost, but it was overwhelmed by a quiet sense of pride in what she had built. Her life wasn't a fairy tale anymore. It was real, it was messy, and it was hers. She was not a millionaire's wife. She was Isabella. She was a mother. And for the first time in a very long time, she was free. The dawn breaking over her new life looked different, softer, more fragile, but infinitely more true. So, what would you have done? If you were lying in that hospital bed, your world shattered, would you have found a way to forgive? Could you rebuild a family from the ashes of such a profound betrayal for the sake of your child? Or is some trust, once broken, lost forever? Let me know in the comments below.